When you study philosophy, you'll find that the ideas that you're studying today have a history. For example, metaphysics. Has been going on for a long time. And if you're studying Western philosophy, you would probably do well to read some histories of Western philosophy. And when you do that, you'll see how different thinkers have different views about topics in philosophy that flow through the history of philosophy. The study of truth is a part of that history of Western philosophy. So in this video series, I've been doing some videos on the history of truth in Western philosophical ideas. And this discussion here will be about truth in modern philosophy and in post-Kantian philosophy, and maybe into the postmodern period. We'll see how far we get on this. So it's interesting how the history of Western philosophy gets divided up. The typical division are pre-Socratic philosophy, ancient philosophy, medieval philosophy, and then modern philosophy, and then postmodern philosophy, and maybe contemporary philosophy. I don't have any problem with those descriptions, except for maybe the medieval one. The term medieval just means the era between. Like there's the ancient philosophy, well, that was really awesome, and then we get to Descartes, and that's really awesome. And then there's the stuff in between. That's the middle part. So my preference is to divide up the history of Western philosophy into the same divisions, roughly, as those descriptions, but to do it this way. There's pre-Christian philosophy, there's Christian philosophy, and then there's post-Christian philosophy, or what comes after people reject Christian philosophy, or try to do away with it. Well, that might be idiosyncratic to me, but there it is. Anyway, this video is going to walk you through just some ideas from modern philosophy and how truth is discussed in the modern period. So the modern period, I don't know, runs probably from Descartes. He dies in 1650, and maybe goes up through Kant, who dies in 1804, I think. So that's about 200 years, roughly. Depends on how when you start modern philosophy. But in a typical history of Western philosophy class, probably modernity starts with Descartes. Although, of course, the bleed over from, say, I don't know, Suarez up to I don't know, to Descartes. That's it's a good chunk of time. So it's hard to tell exactly where ancient philosophy ends and modern philosophy starts. But I think it's safe to say that by 1650, because Suarez and Descartes kind of overlap. But anyway, okay. So enough worry about this isn't an argument to try and determine when modern philosophy starts. But with Descartes, Descartes had a view of truth, and my view is that his was what I call an internal account of correspondence. So Descartes speaks of more of a criterion of truth than he does an attempt to define or give a robust theory of truth. But his account of truth as a criterion, truth as correspondence seems to be implied. So Descartes claims that one has to see very clearly the content of a proposition in order for the proposition to be true. This is, in one sense, an understanding of truth as correspondence between the proposition and the experience of an object, which is dependent on the object itself. So this is especially, I think, the case in his famous cogito, right? So if you read Descartes' Meditations, as he walks through uses skepticism as a kind of methodological skepticism, or as a scalpel to cut away the beliefs that are dubitable. For his cogito, his notion that because I'm aware of my thinking, I'm aware of my existing. So I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum, or je pense donc je suis, however you say it in français. I don't hablo français too good, or Latin too good either. So, but in Descartes' cogito, the I think, therefore I am, his understanding of truth is one of correspondence, insofar as other truths are dependent on the kind of clarity and distinctness found in the cogito. Descartes' view of truth is one of correspondence. So again, when you think about the cogito, Descartes is aware that he's thinking, and he awares that corresponds to his being, right? So the thought and the being correspond to each other. So you might call that an internal view of truth, right? Again, how Descartes works that out for external things is, of course, going to be dependent on the success of his ontological argument, which, in my opinion, fails. But if you're a Cartesian, you can say something about that in the comments if you like. Okay, so let's look at another thinker in the modern period, the great Jewish thinker, Jewish background thinker, Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza. He dies in the late 1600s, 1677 is when he passes away. He also maintained a version of truth as correspondence. Although an understanding of truth as correspondence is found in his account of knowledge, it can be extended out into an account of truth in general. Spinoza maintains that there's a kind of knowledge that proceeds from here's a quote from one of his works, it proceeds from an adequate idea of the formal essence of certain attributes of God to an adequate knowledge of the essence of things. Okay, so now, again, Spinoza is a kind of monist. Everything is divine. There's one thing. It's a kind of correspondence, though, still, right? The two things, which when in place yield a specific kind of knowledge, are one's idea of divine attributes and the essence of things. So divine attributes or divine mind and the essence of things. Seems that when there's the right relationship of correspondence between these two things, then knowledge and truth along with it is present. Okay, so Spinoza wasn't the only rationalist who maintained a correspondence view of truth. Leibniz, of course, he dies in the early 1700s, held to truth as correspondence of well. Here's what Leibniz states, according to Copleston. Truth consists in the correspondence of a proposition with reality, whether possible or actual. Okay, so all three of these rationalist philosophers, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, they were all correspondence theorists about truth. Okay, now even on the empiricist side of the modern house, with the likes of John Locke, for example, he dies in the very early 1700s, 1704. He also continued the tradition of truth as correspondence, which flows from the ancient philosophy through the medieval period. In his essay concerning understanding, he states, quote, "For truth or falsehood, being never without some affirmation or negation, express or tactic, is not to be found, but where signs are joined or separated according to their agreement or disagreement with the things or of the things they stand for," end quote. So in another place in his essay, he says this about truth. Quote, "Truth consists in putting together or separating these signs, according as the things which they stand for agree or disagree." Right? So even Locke, the empiricist, trying to get at everything through experience and through the senses, also recognized that truth is a matter of correspondence. Now you might think when you get to Hume, right, he dies right at the American founding in 1776. When you get to Hume, you might think of Hume as maybe being a skeptic about truth. But in his treatise on human nature, a very long work, he says, when he's arguing about morality not being discoverable by reason, even here he maintains that truth or falsehood consists in agreement or disagreement of real relations of ideas or real existences and matters of fact. So he claims that if anything is not susceptible to agreement or disagreement, it cannot be true or false. This can be constructed as a version of truth as correspondence of truth to reality, where ideas and matters of fact are related in the right way to produce truth. Now, of course, you could try and argue that Hume is inconsistent by trying to maintain a version of truth as correspondence with his skepticism, maintaining that really knowledge is just because knowledge requires matters of fact, and matters of fact require an account of perception of cause and effect. And since we have no perception of that, all of our knowledge, especially in the metaphysical realm, rests upon custom, which he calls a species of natural instinct. And that's inconsistent with a realist correspondence view of truth that's presented, for example, in Aristotle or Aquinas, among others. And I think there's probably a fair criticism there of that. But even if Hume is inconsistent, or his view of correspondence fails based on his views of knowledge in general, as a kind of skepticism, he still clearly tried to maintain truth as correspondence to reality. Even Hume did. Okay. Now, you might think, okay, things get worse, in my opinion, get worse in the history of modern philosophy when you get to Kant. But even with Kant, at the end of quote-unquote modernity, maybe the beginning of postmodern philosophy, Kant, awakened by Hume from his own dogmatism, continued the tradition of truth as correspondence. So this is sort of surprising to me when reading Kant on this. In his Critique of Pure Reason, for example, Kant holds to a definition of truth as, quote, agreement of knowledge with its object. Okay? Agreement of knowledge with its object. He seems to accept rather than argue for the view that truth consists in the agreement of knowledge to object. For example, in the appendix to the Transcendental Dialectic, the regulative employment of the ideas of pure reason, he says this, quote, the categories lead to truth. That is the conformity of our concepts with the object. Now, again, I find this really surprising, this attempt by Kant to hold on to truth as correspondence. The main challenge for Kant here, this just bugs me about Kant, is the noumena phenomena divide. Right? This is now again, this is an oversimplification what I'm presenting here, but if the mind is never really connected to the objects it experiences, if that's the case, as Kant seems to imply, then there is never really an adequation of thing and intellect. There's an adequation of our concepts with the objects as they are experienced inside of our minds, but that is only an internal correspondence, but not a full adequation in the Thomistic, Aristotelian, or even Platonic sense. So it seems to me that all reflection about truth from Kant on will be plagued by this issue. Right? So just as Kant takes all of reality and places our knowledge of it internal to ourselves through the categories of the understanding, where the only things we can know are what is structured by our minds and the structures of our mind itself inside the phenomenal world inside of us, but we can never know anything that's out here in the noumenal world, right? That Kant still wants to hold on to correspondence. He still wants to have some kind of objectivity, but it's all inside. It's all inside the mind. And once you go in, man, you can't get out. Now, thankfully, Kant thought that all of us have the same categories of the understanding, so we're all going to have the same truths within us about the things that Kant thinks we can have truths about. But what if you let that idea go? What if that idea itself goes, right? You have to push Kant on this. How do you know that we all have the same categories, Kant? Why don't I have my categories and you have yours, and someone else has theirs, and those are all contingent upon fill in the blank. Your age, your ethnicity, your gender, your political affiliation, your upbringing, whatever, right? Once you get that far gone, then you end up with a really nasty a nasty mind virus of relativism, and of course Nietzsche will run with that, and he'll just take off with that idea, and that gets us into postmodern philosophy. So I think we'll do a separate video on that. Thanks for watching.